Maybe the nursing school in your hometown had lower standards. That is what Dr. Pierce said 48 minutes before 200 soldiers lined the hallways of St. Michael's to salute the woman he'd just destroyed. Katie Rodriguez moved through the ICU in Philadelphia like water, finding its level, efficient, purposeful, impossible to redirect. Her hands never trembled when starting difficult fours, never fumbled when threading a central line through a patient's subclavian vein. Her gaze tracked 6 monitors simultaneously while charting vitals with one hand and adjusting a morphine drip with the other. The slight limp in her left leg went unnoticed by most people. It was the kind of injury that had a story, but Katie had stopped telling stories the day she signed her medical discharge papers 8 years ago. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez had spent those 8 years rebuilding a life where nobody asked questions. 3 tours in Helmand Province. 2 with the 75th Ranger Regiment's medical attachment, 1 embedded with SEAL Team 3 out of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. 8 years of watching people bleed out in conditions that would make most civilian skin crawl. Sangin Valley in 2015 had been her last deployment, a village northwest of Lashkar Gah where the Taliban moved like ghosts and casualties came in waves that never stopped. Then came the shrapnel. An IED detonated 50 meters from her forward aid station. The blast caught her across the left side, tore through muscle and bone, but she'd kept working. Kept applying tourniquets to Marines whose names she'd learned 3 days prior. Kept running 2 full lines simultaneously on a Navy SEAL with crush injuries and a blood pressure that read like a countdown timer. She'd worked for 4 hours without leaving her station until a captain from the Special Forces Command had physically removed her from the tent. The Army had tried to keep her in service. Offered her a desk position at Fort Bragg. She'd declined and taken the medical discharge instead. The shrapnel scars on her ribs had healed to white lines that felt like old lightning strikes against her skin. Her left leg worked fine, mostly, just a catch in the hip sometimes, a reminder that her body had been reassembled by surgeons in a field tent with limited supplies and a prayer. She'd walked away from all of it. No medals displayed. No unit photos on her phone. No military call sign whispered in crowds. She'd moved to Philadelphia, enrolled in nursing school at Temple University, and become someone new. Someone quiet. Someone nobody wanted to pick a fight with because there was nothing remarkable about her to fight over. St. Michael's Hospital had hired her 3 months ago. Her credentials were solid, practical field medicine translates cleanly into critical care nursing. Her board certification came back clean. Her references mentioned efficiency and composure under pressure. Nobody connected the dots to special forces. Nobody needed to. The trauma shears stayed clipped inside her scrubs pocket, hidden from view. The shears were old, scratched stainless steel with her military call sign engraved into the handle in letters so worn they were barely visible anymore. She'd kept them through every deployment, used them to cut away uniforms from wounded soldiers, cut bandages in the dark with nothing but starlight and muscle memory. Most nurses carried standard hospital-issue shears. Katie carried history. She stopped at the bedside of a young Marine named Rodriguez, no relation, though the coincidence had made her smile the day he'd arrived. He had severe facial burns from an IED explosion 3 weeks prior. Reconstructive surgeries had salvaged what they could, but the scarring was extensive. Grafts. Sutures. The kind of damage that changed the way a person moved through the world. The chart noted cognitive effects from the blast: concussion, memory fragmentation, recognition deficits, difficulty with recent events. Katie checked his medication schedule and noticed his morphine was due to rotate to the next dose window. As she adjusted the 4-pump, she glanced at his forearm. There it was. A tattoo, fresh enough that the surrounding skin still carried the pink of healing. Her name. Her military call sign. Inked into his forearm in clean block letters. She'd pulled him out of Sangin in 2015. A night raid had gone sideways, 2 Marines in a collapsed compound, one with shrapnel embedded in his shoulder. She'd run across open ground while rounds snapped past her like angry insects. The Marine who'd become Rodriguez had been the lighter of the 2. She'd carried him through a quarter mile of Taliban territory with rifle fire following them until the QRF arrived. He'd survived. She'd never expected recognition. He looked straight through her as she adjusted his fore. His eyes tracked the ceiling, the monitors, the machines, everything except the woman standing at his bedside. The memory damage had taken that. Taken the connection. Left only the tattoo. A name carved into skin by someone trying to hold onto a version of himself that no longer existed. Katie finished checking his vitals and moved to the next bed without pause. This was the job. This was the life she'd chosen when she'd walked away from the other one. The afternoon light cut through the ICU windows at an angle that made the linoleum tiles shine like water. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, a chorus of artificial breathing that had become white noise in her ears. Her feet moved from monitor to monitor, bed to bed, checking vital signs and charting observations in the electronic system. Everything was routine. Everything was controlled. Then Dr. Pierce arrived for rounds. She heard him before she saw him, the snap of his white coat, the click of his Italian leather shoes against the tile floor, the particular timbre of his voice as he addressed a resident. The room's energy shifted. Not because he was loud. Because everyone else got quieter. Dr. Pierce had ruled the St. Michael's ICU for 15 years with the kind of authority that comes from being brilliant enough to back up every claim he makes. Cardiothoracic surgeon. Published researcher. Medical director of the unit. The kind of doctor whose opinion shaped patient outcomes and whose bad mood could derail an entire day of rounds. He was tall, silver-haired, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than most nurses' monthly rent. His reputation preceded him like weather, people arranged their schedules around his moods. He hadn't paid Katie much attention during her first month. She'd been invisible in the way new hires sometimes are, competent enough not to stand out, quiet enough not to demand attention. That had been fine. Invisibility was a skill she'd perfected. But today, something changed. A patient in bed 7 had begun deteriorating around 11 a.m. An elderly woman post-op from a bypass procedure, 3 days into recovery. Her oxygen saturation was trending down despite supplemental oxygen, her breath sounds getting quieter on the left side. Katie had documented the change every 30 minutes, watching the numbers decline with the kind of precision that came from having read vital signs in tents where getting it wrong meant someone died. She'd caught the resident, a young doctor named Chen, maybe 3rd year, preparing to call it routine post-op congestion. Katie had approached him at the nursing station, pulled his attention away from his computer, and spoken quietly. Left-sided rhonchi. Diminished breath sounds. Consider tension pneumothorax. Chen had looked at her like she'd spoken a different language. She's stable. For now. That was all she said. One word that made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Chen had looked uncomfortable, but he'd gone to Dr. Pierce anyway. And Dr. Pierce had come to the bedside, examined the patient himself, and ordered a stat chest X-ray. The image came back showing early pneumothorax. A small pocket of air building up in the left pleural space, collapsing the lung gradually. The kind of thing that would have killed the patient in another 6 hours if nobody caught it. Dr. Pierce had inserted a chest tube, and the patient's oxygen sat came back up to normal range within minutes. The thing nobody said out loud was that Katie had caught it. A nurse. Not a doctor. A person whose job description didn't officially include diagnostic thinking. Dr. Pierce had ordered the imaging, but the pathway that led to the order had begun with Katie's assessment. He'd looked at her for exactly 2 seconds after the chest tube placement. A look that contained recognition. And something else. Something that looked like threat assessment. The vending machine incident happened at 3 p.m., 45 minutes after the successful chest tube intervention. Katie was in the break room alcove, feeding dollar bills into the machine for a black coffee. The room wasn't crowded, just her, 2 residents, a nurse from the surgical ward, and Dr. Pierce. He wasn't looking at her. That was the thing about status. You could make statements without directing them at anyone specific. Some nurses come from programs where the standards are, let's say, more forgiving, he said. His voice was conversational. Almost friendly. He was selecting a protein bar, moving with the ease of someone who assumed everyone was listening. Seems like every hospital system has them. Schools that pass anyone with a pulse. One of the residents laughed, a nervous sound that suggested he understood the game being played. Katie kept her eyes on the coffee machine. The cup dropped. The liquid flowed. The machine hissed steam. My hometown had one of those, I think, Dr. Pierce continued, still not looking at her. Still addressing the room like he was sharing a casual observation. Somewhere in the southwest? Funny how some people manage to work at places like St. Michael's despite their unconventional training backgrounds. The room's temperature seemed to drop. Katie removed her coffee. She turned, and her eyes found his for exactly the moment it took to register. She'd heard him. She understood the message. She chose not to acknowledge it. She walked past him without speaking. What he didn't understand, what nobody in that room understood, was that she'd been trained in environments where standing down in the face of provocation was sometimes the only move that kept you alive. She'd learned to let insults drift past like wind. She'd learned that the quietest person in the room was often the one holding it together. But something in her chest had shifted. A recognition of territory being marked. Of a challenge being issued. Not aggressively yet. Just preliminary. Just the way a predator circled before deciding whether you were worth eating. The mini cliffhanger was this: Dr. Pierce had no idea who he was standing next to. He saw a quiet nurse with decent instincts and mistook her for competition he could eliminate through simple social pressure. He didn't know that the limp in her left leg came from shrapnel. That the steady hands came from practicing medicine in a tent with nothing but a flashlight and whatever supplies hadn't been blown up. That the confidence in her assessments came from learning how to read a human body's whisper when you couldn't afford to miss the message. He'd just declared war with a protein bar and an insult. And she was going to let him think he was winning until the moment it mattered most. Katie moved back to the ICU, sipping her coffee with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The burned Marine was sleeping now, morphine keeping him sedated enough not to feel the pain from his reconstructive sites. The tattoo on his arm seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, her name, inked into his skin by hands that no longer recognized her. The afternoon shift continued. The machines beeped. The monitors tracked oxygen and heart rates. Everything proceeded according to protocol. And somewhere in the building, Dr. Pierce returned to his office, convinced he'd established dominance over a competent but ultimately ordinary nurse from a mediocre school. He had no idea what he'd just begun. 3 days later, the conference room at St. Michael's filled with 30 residents and attendings for grand rounds. The fluorescent lights hummed their steady, sterile song above a long mahogany table lined with coffee cups and open charts. Katie stood in the back, her badge clipped to her scrubs beside the trauma shears she'd carried since Sangin, small, worn, invisible to everyone who didn't know what they meant. Dr. Pierce sat at the head of the table like a surgeon king surveying his kingdom, and when he opened Katie's charting from the burned Marine's last shift, his face arranged itself into an expression of theatrical concern. He held the notes up for the entire room to see. His voice moved like a scalpel, precise, clean, designed to cut without leaving visible marks. This, he said, moving the paper through the air as if it were contaminated, is what I call dangerous improvisation. When nurses think their gut feelings override evidence-based protocols. The residents leaned forward, pens poised. Pierce continued, dissecting her pain management decisions with the careful cruelty of someone who'd spent 15 years perfecting the art of public humiliation. Creative at best, he said, turning to the attending next to him. Negligent at worst. A patient's comfort is not a justification for deviating from the established medication schedule. Katie's hands hung at her sides, absolutely still. Her jaw didn't clench. Her breathing didn't change. She'd been trained in rooms far worse than this, rooms where the sound of rotors overhead meant incoming wounded, where the margin between life and death was measured in seconds, not protocols. She watched Dr. Pierce's mouth move, watched the resident scribble notes that would follow her reputation through the hospital, watched him enjoy the weight of his own authority like a man who'd never questioned whether he deserved it. When he finished, the room settled into the uncomfortable silence of people who recognized cruelty but had learned not to name it. Katie raised her eyes and met his stare. 10 seconds stretched between them, long enough for the fluorescent lights to hum, long enough for someone's coffee to cool, long enough for every resident in the room to feel the pressure change. Then she spoke, her voice level and low, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "I've triaged mass casualties in conditions you couldn't imagine," she said, "and I've never lost a patient to ego." She turned and walked toward the door, her boots clicking against the linoleum with the precision of someone moving through a familiar space. The room stayed frozen. Dr. Pierce's mouth opened and closed. One of the attending physicians suddenly became very interested in his coffee. By the time Katie pushed through the conference room doors, Pierce was already recalibrating, already reshaping the narrative in his mind, not as a moment where he'd been equaled, but as a moment where an inexperienced nurse had spoken out of turn and he'd graciously chosen not to discipline her further. But that wasn't the worst part. The next morning, Katie arrived for her shift to find her assignment board had changed. The 3 critical patients she'd been assigned, the ones whose charts she'd reviewed the night before, whose labs she'd memorized, whose subtle decline she'd been tracking with the precision of someone trained to read bodies like text, had been reassigned to Nurse Daniels, a competent but uncertain woman in her 3rd year, and 2 others who'd been at St. Michael's less than 18 months. Katie's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She simply began her shift with the patient she'd been given instead, knowing exactly what was happening. Dr. Pierce had moved from public humiliation to strategic sabotage, from stage 2 to stage 3, the calculated moves of someone who understood that direct power was more effective than loud anger. He began scheduling her exclusively for the night shift. He rearranged the rotation so his day shift authority never had to share space with her presence. And when she worked, he called the nurse's station constantly, contradicting her assessments in the moment, asking for second opinions on her decisions, creating a paper trail of doubt that accumulated like scar tissue. The 4th humiliation came on a Wednesday afternoon when Katie questioned his order. A septic patient, a construction worker named Marcus, 67 years old, with a history of COPT, was failing to wean from the ventilator despite antibiotic coverage and aggressive diuresis. Dr. Pierce had written an order to extubate him at 1400 hours. Katie had spent the previous 2 hours watching Marcus's respiratory drive, watching his chest wall collapse with each breath when the ventilator assisted less, feeling the tremor in his muscles that meant he wasn't ready. Extubating him now would send him back to the ICU within hours, maybe back to intubation by midnight, maybe straight to a code if his airway became compromised. She found Dr. Pierce at the nurse's station, surrounded by the patient's family, Marcus's daughter, his wife of 39 years, his son who'd taken off work from the construction site. Katie's voice stayed low, respectful, the way she'd learned to navigate this hospital's architecture of power. "I'd recommend waiting on the extubation, Dr. Pierce. His respiratory drive isn't stable yet. The accessory muscle use." His face went red. Not the red of someone who was actually angry, but the red of someone whose authority had been questioned in public, in front of witnesses, in front of a family who might wonder if their father's physician knew what he was doing. His voice came out sharp, clipped, designed to wound through official channels. "Security should escort you out if you can't follow basic instructions, Ms. Rodriguez. I'll make that call right now if you continue to interfere with my medical decisions." The daughter looked up from her father's bed. The wife's hand tightened around Marcus's. Katie's jaw tightened, but her hands remained absolutely still at her sides, her breathing steady, her eyes locked on Pierce with a gaze that held no fear and no retreat. When she spoke, her voice dropped an octave, the voice of someone speaking from experience that had been forged in harder places than a hospital conference room. "I've made life or death calls in situations where there was no security to hide behind, Dr. Pierce." She turned and walked to the nurse's station without waiting for his response. Her hands moved on muscle memory, pulling up Marcus's chart, documenting her clinical assessment of his respiratory status, noting the time of Pierce's order, recording her objection to the plan. Everything documented. Everything dated. Everything protected by the armor of medical record keeping that Pierce had forgotten she understood as deeply as he did. Behind closed doors, in his office with the mahogany furniture and the Harvard diploma on the wall, Dr. Pierce made his moves with the precision of a man playing chess 3 moves ahead. He called the chief of surgery, his voice careful and concerned. "I have a staffing concern. A competent nurse, but she's not following protocol, and I'm worried about liability." He called the hospital administrator with similar language, no accusations, just questions framed as patient safety concerns. "I want to ensure we're not exposing ourselves legally." He altered the surgical schedule to ensure he'd be the reviewing physician on any incident report. He called IT and requested restrictions on Katie's computer access, claiming it was routine system maintenance, a security audit, nothing personal. The network of his authority spread like tree roots, invisible and deep, designed to suffocate any career that tried to grow beneath it. Katie went home that evening to find her teenage son waiting at the kitchen table, and on the table between them, a shadow box. Through the glass, her silver star caught the overhead light. 2 bronze stars with Valor. And beneath them, her trauma shears, the call sign engraved on the handle catching the light like a promise she'd made to herself a lifetime ago. Her son's voice came quiet but insistent. "People at school saw something online about you and the military. Is it true?" Katie took the box without a word. Her hands, which had held it together for 16 years, trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what she'd built and what was about to burn. She carried the shadow box to her bedroom closet, placed it behind winter coats and emergency supplies, and locked the door. The medal stayed buried. The past stayed hidden. And in the darkness behind that closet door, something shifted in the architecture of her restraint, a fracture forming, invisible to everyone but her. Tuesday afternoon at St. Michael's started like any other shift, fluorescent lights casting their sterile glow, monitors beeping their constant rhythm, the smell of antiseptic thick enough to taste. Katie was in the ICU with patient 4847, a septic pneumonia case, when the overhead speaker crackled and changed everything. Code orange. Multiple trauma incoming. Construction collapse on Vine Street. All available personnel report to ER. She didn't hesitate. She moved. The ER was chaos before the ambulances even arrived, nurses pulling crash carts into position, residents organizing the bay like soldiers prepping a fire base. For patients inbound, the radio said, "Heavy crush injuries. Possible internal bleeding on all 4. The attending physician, Dr. Morrison, was calling out assignments, pointing Katie toward the resuscitation bay. "Start a central line on trauma 2. We're expecting significant fluid loss." Katie nodded once and moved to the bay where a construction worker lay on the stretcher, his chest exposed and already showing the mottled bruising of rib fractures. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't explain. She just worked, her hands moving through the muscle memory of 1,000 procedures, prepping the insertion site just below the right clavicle, her fingers finding the landmarks, the anterior scalene, the sternocleidomastoid, the subclavian vein running underneath like a river you couldn't see but could navigate blind if you'd done it enough times. She'd done it enough times. The needle went in. No fumbling. No hesitation. The plastic catheter threaded smooth, the guide wire sliding into position. She taped it down with the precision of someone who understood that every second counted, that a central line meant blood products, meant medications that couldn't run through a peripheral 4, meant the difference between saving a patient's life and watching him bleed out on a stretcher. Around her, residents and nurses moved in their own rhythm, less practiced but still competent. For 3 minutes, the bay hummed with controlled urgency, the kind of organized chaos that only happened when people knew their jobs. That was when Trauma 1 flatlined. The monitor that had been showing a steady sinus rhythm suddenly spiked into an erratic jagged line, the electrical signature of a heart that wasn't pumping anymore. A nurse called out, "He's in V-fib." Another reached for the defibrillator pads. But the patient's chest, his chest was catastrophic. Massive crush injury had created an air leak, and now the pressure inside his thoracic cavity was compressing his heart, compressing his lungs, making every molecule of oxygen irrelevant because nothing could move anymore. Not with mechanical compressions. Not with a defibrillator. This wasn't cardiac arrest. This was a tension pneumothorax, and it had progressed past the point where standard ACLS protocols meant anything at all. The residents froze. Katie watched them, 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all in their PGY-1 or PGY-2 years, all trained, all competent in theory, all standing absolutely motionless as the monitor continued its lethal flatline. The attending was in the elevator. The surgical team was 3 floors up in an operating room. There was no one else. Katie moved. She didn't ask permission. She didn't call out orders or wait for someone to authorize her. She just walked to the crash cart, opened the surgical tray, and grabbed the largest scalpel with the same calm she'd used in Sangin when her unit was taking fire and the medic had gone down and there was a soldier who needed his airway opened and she was the only one who could do it. Her hands found the intercostal space, the 4th or 5th rib. She didn't need to count, her body knew, and she made the incision. The sound that came next was specific. Bone cracking. She'd heard it before. A left anterolateral thoracotomy wasn't surgery. It was survival. It was what you did when everything else had failed and the only choice was to reach inside and fix it with your hands. She cracked his ribs. The sound was sharp, unmistakable, the kind of noise that made everyone in the room go absolutely still except for her. Blood rushed out. She reached in, her fingers finding the pericardium, tearing through it with the kind of controlled violence that looked like butchery to untrained eyes but was actually the most precise work there was, and found the heart. Pale. Still. Useless. She began manual cardiac massage. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. Not the compressions they teach in CPR classes. This was direct cardiac massage, her fingers wrapping around the patient's heart the way you'd hold something you were trying to wake up, something you were willing back to life through pure determination. 90 seconds. That's all it took. The heart filled with her compressions. Pink color flooded back into the myocardium. The monitor changed. Sinus rhythm. 1 beat. 2 beats. The electrical signal held. The patient's chest began to rise on its own, the lungs remembering how to inflate now that the pressure had released. Color came back to his face like someone was filming the moment in reverse, death sliding backward into life. That was when Dr. Morrison burst through the doors, already gowning, already moving toward the bay. He saw the patient. He saw the open chest cavity. He saw Katie, her hands covered in blood, stepping back from the crash cart with the kind of calm that made it clear she'd done this before. His expression shifted, something like awe flickering across his face for just a moment before his training took over and he was moving, assessing, calling out orders for the surgical team to get down here now, we're bypassing the elevator, meet us in OR in 4 minutes. Katie was already moving to the sink, washing her hands. 2 of the residents were documenting what they'd seen. The 3rd was staring at her like she'd just materialized from somewhere else entirely. But it was what happened next that changed everything. Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway at exactly 2:47 p.m., 7 minutes after the patient's heart had restarted. He surveyed the scene with the kind of clinical detachment that made Katie's jaw tighten, his eye scanning the open chest, the blood, the patent airway, Katie's wet scrubs, the documentation already being entered into the patient's chart by the 3 residents. For 3 seconds, his face went carefully blank. That was the dangerous part. That wasn't anger. That was calculation. He pulled Dr. Morrison into the hallway. Katie watched through the glass partition as Pierce gestured, not aggressive, just precise hand movements that somehow made the attending's impressed expression slowly shift into something closer to concern. Doubt. Uncertainty. In the span of 90 seconds, she watched Dr. Pierce reframe what she'd just done from a life-saving emergency thoracotomy into something that looked, from a certain angle, like a protocol violation. By 3:15 p.m., all 3 residents who'd witnessed the save were being reassigned. New shifts. Different floors. Effective immediately. Their protests, "But we're supposed to work this rotation," were overruled by a text message from the chief nursing officer that came directly from Dr. Pierce's office. By 3:47 p.m., Katie's computer login was disabled. When she tried to document her version of the procedure, the screen returned an error. Your access has been restricted pending administrative review. Contact your department director for reinstatement. She was standing in the hallway, staring at the dark monitor, when her phone buzzed. A text from her 17-year-old son. Hey Mom. Uncle Marcus is in town and wants to grab dinner tonight. You coming or working late again? She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she typed back, I might be late. She didn't mention why. She didn't mention that she could see exactly how this was going to play out, how Dr. Pierce would file incident reports, how he'd frame this as unauthorized surgical intervention by non-physician staff, how he'd construct a narrative where she'd overstepped her scope, how the hospital would have no choice but to take it seriously. She'd seen administrative retaliation before. She'd survived worse than losing a job. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd finally let someone see what she was, and now she had to watch him destroy her for it. Within 48 hours, Dr. Pierce had made 3 phone calls that would reshape Katie's entire life. The first went to the chief of surgery at 7 in the morning, his voice carefully modulated with concern rather than anger, the tone of a man worried about institutional standards. I need to flag something for you, he'd said, speaking slowly as if reluctant to betray a colleague. We had an incident in the trauma bay. A nurse performed an unauthorized thoracotomy. Cracked the patient's chest with a scalpel. I'm not questioning her intentions, but we need to discuss scope of practice before this becomes a liability. The chief of surgery listened. The second call went to the hospital administrator at 8:45, this time framed as a confidential discussion about maintaining protocols in a teaching institution. Pierce mentioned the burned Marine patient, the one with Katie's name tattooed on his forearm. She seems to have some kind of personal relationship with that patient, Pierce said carefully. Could be nothing. Could be a judgment issue. By 9:30, both men were concerned. By noon, they were convinced. Katie didn't know any of this yet. She was in the ICU, checking ventilator settings on a post-op patient, her hand steady and her focus sharp as it had been for 8 years. The patient's oxygen saturation was climbing toward 92%, which was exactly what should happen, and Katie made a note in the chart, her handwriting precise as a surgical incision. She'd learned long ago that documentation was armor. Write it down, date it, sign it. Create a record that couldn't be erased or rewritten. She'd kept meticulous records in Sangin too, logging every casualty she'd treated, every field procedure, every outcome. Some habits never died. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Dr. Pierce had already set in motion behind closed doors. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Katie noticed that the 3 nurses who'd been present during the construction accident thoracotomy, Martinez, Chen, and Williams, were no longer on the ICU rotation. Their schedules had been changed. All 3 of them, reassigned to different units, different shifts, scattered across St. Michael's like pieces of a puzzle that could no longer fit together. Katie didn't ask about it. Asking questions drew attention. But she understood what had happened. Witnesses who couldn't corroborate her story were witnesses who couldn't testify. At 2 o'clock, she tried to access the electronic medical records system to document her account of the emergency procedure. The screen froze. She tried again. A dialog box appeared, access denied. Contact IT for reinstallation. Her computer access had been restricted. Not deactivated, restricted. A subtle move, one that looked like a technical glitch rather than deliberate sabotage. Katie sat very still in front of the monitor, watching the cursor blink in that black box, and her hands remained relaxed on the keyboard. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Dr. Pierce had also altered the surgical review schedule. The attending physician who'd been seconds away when Katie performed the thoracotomy, the one who could have verified that the patient would have died without intervention, was now listed as unavailable for the official case review. Dr. Pierce himself had volunteered to serve as the reviewing physician. His presence made the air pressure change. His control was absolute. At 4:45 in the afternoon, Katie's phone buzzed with a calendar notification: HR meeting, conference room 3B, 5 p.m. No details. No context. Just a door number and a time. She knew what it meant. She'd seen this before in the military: the gathering before the dismissal, the formal documentation of what had already been decided in backrooms and telephone calls. She closed the patient charts, removed her ID badge from its plastic clip, and walked toward the administrative wing. Her pace was even. Her breathing was steady. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in a hard white glow, and her shadow moved alongside her like a ghost that had already accepted its own disappearance. Conference room 3B was exactly as impersonal as she'd expected. A table, 3 chairs, windows overlooking the parking lot. The hospital administrator sat on one side, a woman named Jennifer Cross whose expression suggested she was reviewing a spreadsheet rather than a person's career. The chief of surgery occupied the chair beside her, a man named Rothstein whose hands were folded in front of him like he was praying. Dr. Pierce stood by the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass, positioned as though he'd simply wandered into the room rather than orchestrated it. "We need to discuss yesterday's incident," Jennifer Cross began, not inviting Katie to sit. Katie remained standing. "We received reports that you performed a procedure outside your scope of licensure. A thoracotomy, without authorization from an attending physician. The patient was in cardiac arrest," Katie said. 10 words. Fragments were better than speeches. Attending was suiting up. No time to wait. "That's precisely the problem," Dr. Pierce interjected from the window, his voice perfectly conversational. "We have standards precisely to prevent this kind of cowboy medicine. You don't get to decide when protocols are inconvenient." Katie's jaw tightened. Not from anger. From something much colder than anger, from the recognition that she was watching a predator finish its meal. "The patient survived," Katie said. "He's stable. His BP is holding." The chief of surgery cleared his throat. "We're aware the patient's condition has improved. But the method by which that improvement occurred was the only method available in 3 minutes," Katie finished. "If I'd waited for an attending, he'd be in the morgue instead of post-op." Jennifer Cross made a note on the paper in front of her, though Katie couldn't see what she'd written. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps just the gesture of writing was enough to make this feel official, documented, irrevocable. "Your actions, while well-intentioned, constitute practicing medicine without a license," the hospital administrator said. "We're terminating your employment effective immediately, for gross violation of protocol and practicing outside your scope of licensure. Your badge access is being deactivated as you leave this room." Katie didn't move. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice came out level, calibrated as a gauge. "I saved his life." "You violated standards," Dr. Pierce said quietly, almost gently, and that gentleness was worse than any shout. "And now you'll have to accept the consequences." The door closed behind Katie as she left the conference room, and the sound of it closing was the sound of an ending. She could still hear them talking through the reinforced door, Jennifer Cross saying something about liability, Dr. Pierce's voice offering sympathies that sounded like applause. She didn't look at the burned Marine when she passed the ICU, couldn't look, because if she made eye contact now, she might break, and breaking was a luxury she didn't have. The basement of St. Michael's smelled like industrial detergent and fluorescent hum, a chemical-electric bouquet that made the sinuses burn. Katie stood at the laundry return window with an empty box in her hands, folding her scrubs one piece at a time. The navy blue tops came first, the one she'd worn during codes, the fabric soft from 4 months of washing. The pants with faded knees from kneeling beside dying patients. The undershirt she'd layered beneath everything, always thinking about the next shift, the next patient, the next emergency. She folded each piece precisely, seams aligned, no wrinkles. Even in destruction, precision mattered. The janitor waited on the other side of the counter, occasionally checking his watch like she was an inconvenience keeping him from his actual work. He had no idea that the woman folding scrubs had carried trauma patients 300 meters through enemy fire. He had no idea that those hands had held lives together in conditions he couldn't imagine. To him, she was just someone returning hospital linens. She placed the last pair of scrubs in the bin. Her badge had been deactivated at the HR exit. Her computer access was already gone. Her name was probably already being removed from the online directory, her phone extension reassigned, her locker emptied by security. 8 years of classified service and a new nursing degree, both ended in a basement that smelled like bleach and failure, both reduced to a stack of returned laundry and a watch-checking janitor. Katie picked up the empty box and walked toward the parking lot. The evening rain started at exactly 5:57, falling hard enough to sound like applause on the asphalt. She didn't hurry. The rain didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered anymore except that she was unemployed and exposed and completely, utterly finished. It was walking through that rain with the box in her arms that her teenage son found her. Her teenage son found her in the hospital parking lot, rain streaming down his face, carrying a shadow box like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He was breathless, 14 years old and burning with a fury she'd never taught him, and he thrust the box toward her with both hands. Inside, her medals caught the fluorescent glow from the hospital entrance, the silver star first, then 2 bronze stars with Valor, then the purple hearts. Beside them lay her trauma shears, the metal worn smooth from years of field use, her call sign engraved along the handle in letters only she'd ever been allowed to see. "Mom, they need to see these," he said, his voice cracking like he was the adult and she was the one who'd fallen apart. "You can't just let him win." Katie stood in the rain, the termination letter already soaked in her box of belongings, and something shifted behind her eyes. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder than that. Something with muscle memory. She looked at her son's face, the determination there, the refusal to accept her erasure, and she nodded once. They walked back into St. Michael's together, past security who recognized her and said nothing, into the lobby where the hospital board was still gathered around Dr. Pierce as he grandstanded about maintaining standards and protecting patients from unstable elements. His voice carried the confidence of a man who'd never been contradicted, never been checked, never stood in front of someone whose hands had held lives together in conditions that would have shattered him completely. The burned Marine was sitting in the waiting area, the one with the fractured memory, the one whose scarring had stolen his recognition of her, and when he saw Katie walk past in her scrubs with the shadow box, something flickered across his face. Not memory exactly. Muscle memory of gratitude. He stood up. "That's Senior Chief Rodriguez," he said, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. His voice came out rough, damaged from the smoke inhalation that had happened the same night he'd been burned, but it carried absolute certainty. "She's the one who saved me in Sangin. She carried me through enemy fire when nobody else would." Dr. Pierce's face went pale. He turned to look at Katie and she met his eyes with the kind of stillness that comes from having already survived the worst. The hospital chaplain, Father Mitchell, a former Navy reservist who'd served 2 tours, heard the commotion and stood up from his desk in the chapel office. He pulled up Katie's unit history on his computer and his hands began to tremble as he read. He walked into that lobby and started reading citations in a voice that shook, reading the names of operations she'd been part of, reading the official accounts of what she'd done during her 2 tours in Helmand Province. Bronze Star for Valor in combat. Silver Star for actions that had saved an entire convoy from an ambush. The words hung in the air like they were being translated from another language, a language Dr. Pierce had never learned and couldn't speak. Then the doors to the executive conference room opened and Rear Admiral Thomas Blackwell, who'd been visiting a grandson in pediatrics, stepped into the hallway. He'd overheard the commotion from 2 floors up and come down to investigate. He listened for approximately 30 seconds before he began speaking. "Silver Star," he said, each word deliberate as a gavel strike. 2 bronze stars with Valor. He paused, and the silence was so thick you could operate in it. 3 deployments. 0 malpractice complaints. 0 patient deaths attributable to her care. He looked directly at Dr. Pierce. "I'd be curious what your record shows, Doctor." A man in a charcoal suit stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, his identification already being palmed toward the hospital administrator. CIA. He introduced himself with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone else's credentials feel like participation trophies. Senior Chief Rodriguez's code name is classified, he said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage. But I can tell you that her medical saves are documented in triple digits. The specific number is classified. What isn't classified is that she has a perfect safety record and the highest commendation score in our medical personnel database. He glanced at Dr. Pierce with an expression of absolute disdain. The Pentagon takes care of its own, Doctor. You should have thought about that before you started making phone calls. Dr. Pierce's hands were shaking now. His competence had been his armor for 15 years, and Katie had shattered it with a single procedure. His administrative manipulation had unraveled in real time. He had no more moves. No more authority to leverage. He did what cornered men do, he panicked. He left St. Michael's without a word to staff, got in his car, and drove directly to Channel 6 News. His hands gripped the steering wheel at 90 degrees, jaw clenched so hard his temples were twitching. He pulled into the parking lot and walked into the newsroom like a man on fire, demanding an emergency interview, demanding airtime, demanding to tell his side before the narrative solidified against him. The station manager saw a medical scandal, the kind of story that got picked up by national news, the kind that drove ratings. Within 90 minutes, Dr. Pierce was sitting across from anchor Maria Castellano, the studio lights making his skin look like wax, his expression carefully composed into concern. I want to talk about a disturbing trend, he began, his voice measured and grave. Mentally unstable veterans playing hero in medical settings where their PTSD and military training make them dangerous to patients. Unpredictable. Unstable. He described the thoracotomy incident in detail, framing her combat training not as expertise but as trauma, framing her field medicine not as saving lives but as reckless behavior in a hospital environment. We have standards, he said, to protect patients from this kind of dangerous improvisation. The anchor was nodding, asking questions that led him deeper into his narrative, when the studio phone rang. The producer took the call, and Katie watched on a monitor in the St. Michael's waiting room as the woman's face went white. She walked onto the set and whispered to the anchor. The anchor's expression changed. She held up one hand to stop Dr. Pierce mid-sentence. We're being told we have a call from a 4-star general, she said slowly. General Howard Kemp, who wishes to provide some context about the service member you're describing. The speaker crackled. General Kemp's voice came through clear and steady, the kind of command presence that made everything else in the room sound like background noise. Dr. Pierce, he began, you have just publicly slandered one of the most decorated medical personnel in Special Forces history. A woman shot 3 times while shielding a Navy officer during an ambush in Sangin Valley. A woman who continued treating wounded soldiers for 48 minutes under active fire until evacuation was secured. A woman whose field thoracotomy, performed with a combat knife, not a scalpel, because that's what was available, saved the life of Navy SEAL Marcus Holloway. The same procedure you described as reckless on live national television. Dr. Pierce tried to interrupt. The general's voice didn't change tempo or volume. He just kept speaking. Senior Chief Rodriguez's service record includes 0 malpractice complaints. 0 patient deaths attributable to her care. Commendations from 17 different commanding officers across 3 combat deployments. Her medical decisions have been reviewed and validated by military physicians at the highest levels of the Pentagon. I would like to know, Dr. Pierce, what does your record show? How many patients have complained about your conduct? How many incident reports have been filed against you? How many career military medical personnel have you sabotaged in the last 15 years? The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then the anchor interrupted the interview and cut to commercial, her face a mask of barely concealed disgust. Pierce sat on the set like a man watching his house burn from the inside out. Social media was already flooding with clips. His name was already trending. His career was already over. Katie stood in the St. Michael's lobby watching it play out on the waiting room television, her son beside her, the burned Marine standing at attention like he was still in uniform, the chaplain with his hands clasped in front of him, the CIA officer making a phone call to someone in Washington. Dr. Pierce's termination came through at 7 in the morning. the state medical board opened an investigation at 8. His privileges were suspended by noon. By the end of the week, he was working at a strip mall clinic in northeast Philly, sandwiched between a check-cashing store and a vape shop, treating strep throat and writing work notes to people who'd never heard his name and never would. Katie returned to St. Michael's on a Monday morning in a new set of scrubs. The hospital board had created a new position, Director of Emergency Medical Services, and offered it to her with an apology that cost them nothing because it came too late. The trauma shears with her engraved call sign were clipped to her belt where everyone could see them. She walked through the lobby toward the ICU, and they were waiting for her. 200 active duty soldiers in dress uniform lined both sides of the hallway. Some were from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Some were from the 75th Ranger Regiment. Some had served with her in Sangin. Most had only known her reputation, the senior chief who'd saved more lives than anyone had a right to save, whose name circulated through military medical networks like a legend, like something too improbable to be true until the evidence showed it wasn't. They stood at attention. They saluted as she walked past, their uniforms sharp enough to cut, their respect so absolute it made the air pressure change. The burned Marine from Sangin was at the end of the line. His memory had never returned. His face was still scarred from that night 8 years ago. But his body remembered what his mind couldn't, and he saluted sharper than anyone, his hand coming up to his forehead with the precision of someone who understood gratitude in its purest form. Katie walked between those 200 soldiers, her face carefully controlled, her eyes bright, and entered the ICU where a new nurse was waiting with charts and questions and the beginning of her real work. As she disappeared through the doors, one of the residents whispered to a younger nurse, that senior Chief Rodriguez. The words carried weight now. They carried meaning. They carried the full truth of who had been standing in that hospital all along, invisible until the moment when invisibility became impossible. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. Some carry trauma shears engraved with call signs. Some walk through rain in parking lots and come back stronger. Subscribe to the Code Whisperers for more stories of the people nobody sees until the moment everything changes. Like this video if you believe hidden strength matters. Comment below, what would you have done in Katie's position?